She said the land was hers now. 25 cabins. I asked for the deed. Then the county sided with her. I lost my temper. I lost hope. 6 months later, everything changed. A letter arrived, one my grandfather wrote in 1962. It named a dam. My name is David Reyes, and I grew up on 40 acres my grandfather carved out of the Ozark Hills, land he called Reyes Hollow. I inherited it at 26 after my father passed, along with an old earthen dam he built to feed Willow Creek and irrigate the lower fields. By the time I turned 34, I'd let most of the farming go, keeping only a modest cabin, a fishing pond below the dam, and the quiet I'd always loved. I worked remotely as a structural engineer, content with solitude, until Pinewood Ridge Estates broke ground on the ridge above me. Pinewood Ridge had existed for a decade already, a gated community of vacation homes for retirees and weekend visitors from the city. Its president, Denise Calloway, ran the HOA like a small kingdom, famous around town for finding neighbors over mailbox colors and unapproved garden gnomes. I'd met Denise twice before trouble started. Both times at the feed store. Both times she'd looked at my truck and my boots like I'd tracked something onto her shoe. She had a way of speaking to people as if she were doing them a favor just by acknowledging they existed. The first sign of real trouble came when a survey crew showed up on my property line one Tuesday morning without so much as a knock on my door. I found 3 men in orange vests staking flags across my lower field, right along the creek bank my grandfather had dammed decades earlier. When I asked what they were doing, one of them shrugged and said they were marking the boundary for a new HOA development phase. I told him this was my land, that I had the deed inside my house if he wanted to see it. He just said he was following the survey they'd been given. That survey, I'd later learn, had been drawn up by a man named Gary Holt, a county licensed surveyor who happened to be Denise Calloway's first cousin. At the time, though, I only knew him as a name on a clipboard, and I trusted that a licensed surveyor wouldn't simply invent a boundary. I called the county planning office and was told the matter was still in review, that no permits had been finalized, and that I should reach out directly to the HOA if I had concerns about the proposed development. It felt like being handed a phone number for the person stealing from me. So I drove up to Pinewood Ridge myself, past the wrought iron gate with its brass pinewood crest, and found Denise Calloway standing in her driveway in white linen, sipping coffee like she'd been expecting me. She smiled the way people smile when they already know they've won something. "Mister," she said, before I'd even introduced myself. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I told her the survey crew had staked flags on my side of the creek. She said the survey was accurate, that the boundary had always run along the ridge, not the water. I told her my grandfather built that dam himself in 1962, on land his father had owned since before the county even had zoning maps. She waved a hand like she was swatting a fly. "Old deeds get sloppy, David. That's why we have modern surveys. Progress doesn't wait for nostalgia." I left without raising my voice, though it cost me everything I had not to. That night I dug through my grandfather's old filing cabinet, the one my father never touched after he died, looking for the original deed, the county plat, anything that would prove the boundary I'd grown up believing in. I found the deed easily enough. Brittle and yellowed, describing the property from the ridge crest to the center line of Willow Creek, together with all water and dam rights appurtenant thereto. It was clear. It was specific. Whatever Gary Holt had drawn for the HOA. I photographed every page and drove the copies to the county recorder's office first thing the next morning, expecting the matter to end quickly once someone in authority actually looked at the paperwork. The clerk was kind enough, but told me disputes like mine went through a formal review process that could take months. Meanwhile, the flags stayed in the ground. Survey stakes fluttered along my creek bank like a taunt, and every time I walked down to check my fishing pond, I saw them, a quiet reminder that somewhere in an office downtown, a piece of paper was being weighed against my family's whole history. I asked around town about Denise Calloway and learned she'd moved to Pinewood Ridge 8 years earlier from Dallas, arriving with money nobody quite understood the source of. She'd become HOA president within 2 years, and neighbors said her rise had been unusually fast for someone so new to the community.
My closest neighbor on the hollow side, a retired paralegal in her 70s, told me over coffee that she'd watched 3 HOA presidents come and go before Denise, and none of them had wielded power quite like her. That woman collects favors, Odile said, the way some folks collect stamps.
Odile had her own history with the HOA. She'd fought a fine over a wheelchair ramp 2 years back and won, but only after hiring a lawyer she couldn't really afford. She warned me that Denise didn't lose gracefully, and that losing to a woman like Denise usually meant losing quietly, in private. I filed a formal boundary dispute with the county that week, attaching the 1962 deed and requesting an independent resurvey. The clerk warned me these things moved slowly, that Pinewood Ridge's application for a new phase of construction was already scheduled for a preliminary hearing in just under a month. I asked what the new phase entailed, and the clerk pulled up a file showing plans for 25 vacation cabins, clustered along the ridge and spilling down toward the creek, down, specifically, toward the exact stretch of land my grandfather's dam had been built to protect and irrigate. 25 cabins. Parking lot. Half in disbelief, trying to picture that many rooftops crowding the quiet hollow where I'd fished as a kid. It wasn't just a boundary dispute anymore. It was an entire subdivision, planned and priced, waiting only for a signature. That night I called my cousin Marisol, a paralegal in Little Rock, and read her the deed language over the phone. She told me appurtenant water and dam rights was strong language, the kind attorneys loved. But she also warned me that strong language on paper didn't always survive a fight with money. HOAs like that, she said, usually have insurance, lawyers on retainer, and neighbors who'll believe anything the president tells them. You're going to need more than a deed. You're going to need patience, and probably a lawyer of your own, because paper rights mean nothing if nobody enforces them. I didn't have money for a lawyer, not one who could go toe-to-toe with an HOA's legal fund. So I did the only thing I could. I started keeping records. Photos of every survey stake, copies of every email, dates and times of every visit from crews I hadn't invited. I didn't know it yet, but that habit, the quiet, boring discipline of writing everything down, would end up mattering more than any single confrontation I had with Denise Calloway. Some fights aren't won in the moment. They're won months later, in a folder nobody thought to check. The preliminary hearing came faster than I expected, held in a cramped county meeting room with folding chairs and a hum of fluorescent lights. Denise arrived in a tailored blazer, flanked by an HOA attorney and Gary Holt himself, all three of them radiating the calm of people who'd already rehearsed their answers. I sat alone with a folder of photocopies, feeling distinctly outmatched. The county planner opened by summarizing the proposed 25-cabin development, calling it an exciting expansion for Pinewood Ridge, a phrase that made my stomach turn considering it was expanding directly onto land my family had owned for 60 years. When my turn came, I presented the 1962 deed, reading the water and dam rights language aloud, watching the commissioners' faces for any flicker of doubt. Denise's attorney stood immediately, arguing that a licensed 2019 survey superseded any informal historical description from an era before modern GPS boundary technology existed. I pointed out that the deed was recorded, legally binding, and older than any survey Gary Holt could produce. The attorney countered that Mr. Holt's survey had been independently verified, a claim that struck me as strange, since I'd never seen any second surveyor's name attached to a single document. The commission chair, a tired-looking man named Pete Nunley, said the matter would require further review before any final permits were issued, but that preliminary site work, grading, utility trenching, and access roads could proceed under a conditional approval while boundary questions were resolved through the proper legal channels. I left that meeting stunned. They were letting her build first and argue later, letting bulldozers move dirt while my deed sat in some drawer waiting for review. Denise passed me in the hallway, close enough to whisper, "You should have just sold to us, David. Would have saved everybody a lot of trouble." What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn for weeks, was that Pete Nunley had voted in Denise's favor because he sat on the board of a small real estate investment fund that Denise herself had quietly organized 2 years earlier, one that stood to profit directly from cabin sales. Within days, backhoes appeared on the ridge, clearing brush and grading roads for the new cabins. I watched from my porch as trees I'd climbed as a boy came down in a single afternoon, their trunks dragged aside like they'd never mattered, while survey stakes crept closer and closer to my creek. I called the county attorney's office again, asking how conditional approval could allow construction before a boundary dispute was settled. A junior clerk, sympathetic but powerless, told me construction permits and boundary determinations were technically handled by separate departments, a bureaucratic split that seemed designed to let exactly this kind of thing happen. Odalise came by one evening with a bottle of wine and a grim expression, telling me she'd heard through the community grapevine that Denise had already started pre-selling several of the cabins to out-of-state buyers, retirees from Ohio and Michigan looking for a mountain getaway, months before permits were even finalized. That detail nagged at me. Selling something you don't fully own yet, before the land dispute over that very property has been resolved, wasn't just aggressive business, it edged toward fraud. I filed it away, another loose thread in a story that was clearly bigger than a boundary line. I tried reaching out to a local attorney, a woman named Priya Anand who handled land disputes on a sliding scale for rural clients. She reviewed my deed and agreed the language was strong, but warned me the county's slow walking of my claim, paired with active construction, meant I needed to act fast. Priya suggested I request an emergency injunction to halt construction until the boundary review concluded, arguing that irreversible harm, cabins built on disputed land, would be far worse to undo later than simply pausing work now. It felt like the first real path forward I'd been offered in weeks. Filing the injunction cost more than I had saved. Money I pulled from an account meant for my roof repairs. I told myself it was worth it, that stopping construction now would save me a much larger fight later. Once cabins were standing and lawyers could argue over reasonable reliance. The injunction hearing was set for 2 weeks out, giving Denise's crews 2 more weeks to keep grading, keep pouring foundations, keep building toward a finish line she clearly intended to cross before anyone could stop her. Every day of delay felt like watching sand run through a broken hourglass. During that window, I started noticing a man on the construction crew who didn't quite fit. Older, quieter, watching more than working. His name, I'd later learn, was Ray Tuthill, a contractor Denise had hired specifically for his experience and his silence. Though silence, turned out, wasn't quite what he offered. Ray approached me one afternoon at the gas station, keeping his voice low, saying only that he'd seen some paperwork that didn't add up on the Pinewood job, and that he might want to talk someday, if things ever got bad enough. I gave him my number and didn't expect a call. The injunction hearing arrived, and Priya argued forcefully for a halt to construction, presenting my deed alongside satellite images showing the creek's historical path unchanged since the 1960s. Denise's attorney countered with Gary Holt's survey and a stack of permits, framing my claim as a last-minute obstruction to lawful development. The judge, a careful woman named Judge Whitfield, ruled for a partial injunction, halting further work specifically within 100 feet of the creek's center line until the boundary dispute was formally resolved, but allowing construction to continue on the upper ridge lots further from the disputed waterline. It wasn't the full victory I wanted, but it was something. The creekside lots, the ones sitting most directly on land my grandfather's dam had been built to serve, went quiet. For the first time in weeks, I walked down to my pond without the sound of engines drowning out the birds. Denise did not take the ruling well. Word came back through Odalise that she'd called an emergency HOA board meeting, furious that one landowner with an old piece of paper could stall a multimillion-dollar project she'd spent 2 years planning. Her fury, I sensed, wasn't really about 25 cabins. It was about control. I should have felt satisfied, but instead I felt exposed. A partial injunction meant a partial truce, and truces with someone like Denise Calloway rarely held for long. I doubled down on gathering evidence, requesting public records on every permit, every board vote, every dollar tied to the Pinewood Ridge expansion. What I found in those records, over the following weeks, would turn a simple property dispute into something far darker. A pattern of decisions that looked less like an ambitious HOA president cutting corners and more like a woman who had been building something crooked, brick by brick, for years. The first record that caught my attention was a set of HOA meeting minutes from 3 years earlier, describing an emergency reserve fund reallocation that Denise had pushed through during a board meeting attended by only 4 of the 9 members, all of them people I recognized as her closest allies. That reallocation had moved nearly $200,000 from the HOA's maintenance reserve into something called the Pinewood Ridge Growth Initiative, a fund whose paperwork listed Denise Calloway as sole signatory. No competitive bids, no outside audit, no vote from the broader membership, just 4 signatures and a wire transfer. I brought the documents to Priya, who whistled low when she saw the numbers. "This isn't just aggressive management," she said. This looks like she's been using HOA dues to seed her own real estate venture, then using her position as president to fast-track the permits that make that venture profitable. We requested additional records, HOA bylaws, membership rosters, and vote tallies from the board elections that had put Denise in power in the first place. The clerk's office took its time producing them, but when the documents finally arrived, one detail jumped out immediately. The election 2 years prior had no ballots. Ohio buyer Carl Whitmore had wired a deposit on cabin 14 8 months before groundbreaking, based on renderings and a brochure that promised lake access from a private dock. I hadn't heard his name yet, but the brochure itself, when I later obtained a copy, promised amenities on land legally still mine, instead of paper ballots. That election had been conducted entirely through an online portal Denise's own company had set up and administered, with no independent oversight of who voted or how many times. Homeowners I later interviewed said they never received a ballot at all, or a notice that voting was even happening. I started calling residents of Pinewood Ridge directly, something I'd never bothered doing before, assuming they were united behind their president. Instead, I found a surprising number of quietly frustrated homeowners, people who'd been fined for trivial violations while watching Denise's own property skirt every rule she enforced against everyone else. One resident, a retired schoolteacher named Marjorie Klein, told me she'd tried running against Denise in that very election, only to be told 2 days before voting opened that her name had been removed from the ballot due to a paperwork technicality nobody could ever fully explain to her satisfaction. Marjorie still had her old campaign flyers, dated and time-stamped, proving she'd filed her candidacy well within the deadline. It was a small thing, a forgotten grievance from 2 years back, but stacked next to everything else, it read like one more brick in a wall Denise had built around herself. I began to understand that Denise's grip on Pinewood Ridge wasn't accidental charisma or neighborly trust. It was architecture, carefully constructed through rigged elections, unaudited funds, and a board stocked with people too loyal or too intimidated to ask questions. My boundary dispute had cracked open something much larger than a fence line. Priya suggested we bring our findings to the state's HOA Oversight Division, which handled complaints about financial mismanagement and voting irregularities separately from ordinary property disputes. It felt like opening a second front in a war I hadn't planned on fighting, but I no longer felt like I had a choice. We filed the complaint quietly, without alerting Denise, hoping to give investigators time to gather records before she could react. Priya warned me these state reviews moved even slower than county ones, sometimes taking the better part of a year, and that, in the meantime, my original boundary case still needed winning. Meanwhile, construction on the upper ridge lots pressed forward at full speed, cabins rising in wooden frames against the horizon, a visible reminder that whatever legal battles simmered underneath, Denise Calloway's project was still moving, still selling, still becoming real in a way that paperwork alone couldn't easily undo. Carl Whitmore, the retiree from Ohio who'd wired his deposit early, called Pinewood Ridge's sales office that month asking for an update on his cabin's completion date, only to be told construction near the creek, his lot, specifically, had been temporarily paused due to routine permitting adjustments. Nothing more. I didn't know Carl yet, didn't know his name or his story, but somewhere in a call center transcript I'd eventually obtain, that small, dishonest reassurance sat waiting One more piece of evidence that Denise's team was actively hiding the boundary dispute from buyers who had every right to know about it. Ray Tuthill finally called me one night, his voice tight and hurried, saying he needed to talk somewhere Denise's people wouldn't see us together. We met at a diner 2 towns over, where he slid a folder across the table containing photographs of invoices he said didn't match the materials actually delivered to the site. Ray explained that he'd been asked to sign off on inspection reports for foundations he'd never personally checked. Work that a county inspector named Walt Griggs had apparently approved without visiting the site at all. "I've built houses 30 years, Ray said.
I know when paperwork's covering for...
I asked Ray why he was telling me this instead of simply staying quiet and collecting his paycheck like everyone else on the crew. He looked at his coffee for a long moment before answering. "My daughter's buying a place like this someday. I don't want her handed something built on lies." That conversation gave me a name, Walt Griggs, and a new thread to pull. Public inspection records showed Griggs had signed off on foundation approvals for Pinewood Ridge at a pace that seemed almost impossible. Sometimes multiple detailed inspections logged within the same single afternoon, miles apart from each other. Priya cross-referenced Griggs's inspection logs with his personal vehicle's toll records, obtained through a records request, and found exactly what we suspected. On at least 4 occasions, Griggs had logged an inspection at Pinewood Ridge, while toll data placed his truck nearly 40 miles away at the same recorded time. It wasn't proof of bribery on its own, but it was proof of fraud, falsified inspection records. Plain and simple, the kind of finding that could jeopardize every single permit issued for the development if it came to light. I felt something shift inside me, a fragile hope replacing months of frustration. I brought the toll records and Ray's photographs to the state HOA Oversight Division alongside our original financial complaint, hoping the combination would finally force someone with real authority to take a hard look at Pinewood Ridge. An investigator named Renata Ose called me back within the week. Cautiously interested, Renata warned me these things took time to build properly, that a single sloppy filing could sink an otherwise strong case if a good defense attorney found a technicality to exploit. She asked me to keep gathering records quietly, to avoid tipping off Denise before the investigation had real teeth behind it. Keeping quiet was harder than it sounded. Every time I drove past Pinewood Ridge's gate, past the growing skeleton of cabins on the ridge, I wanted to shout what I knew from the rooftops. Instead, I nodded politely at Denise when we crossed paths in town, swallowing my anger like a stone. Denise, for her part, seemed to sense something had shifted, even without knowing exactly what. She started showing up at community events more often, glad-handing residents, hosting a barbecue to celebrate Pinewood Ridge's exciting future, as if warmth and charm could paper over whatever cracks she suspected were forming beneath her feet. At that barbecue, I overheard her telling a cluster of homeowners that the boundary confusion with a neighboring landowner had been essentially resolved, a claim that was flatly false given the ongoing litigation, but one that most residents, trusting their president, simply accepted without question or follow-up. Marjorie Klein, standing near me, muttered under her breath that Denise had been saying things like that for years, always a step ahead of the truth, always managing the story before anyone else could tell it. "She's not just confident," Marjorie said. "She's rehearsed." Time. That comment lodged in my mind. I asked Marjorie what she meant, and she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Denise had lived somewhere in Texas before Pinewood Ridge. and that she'd once overheard Denise mention the last community, in a tone that suggested it hadn't ended entirely on good terms. I asked Marisol, my cousin in Little Rock, to help me search for any public records tied to Denise Calloway in Texas. Took her a few days, but she eventually found something. A civil lawsuit filed against a Denise Calloway in a Dallas suburb HOA, 5 years before she'd arrived in our county. The lawsuit, settled quietly and sealed from public detail, had accused a D. Calloway of financial mismanagement as HOA treasurer, allegations strikingly similar to what I now suspected here. The settlement terms were confidential, but the mere existence of a prior, eerily similar dispute felt like more than coincidence. I brought this discovery to Renata Osei, who confirmed she could request the sealed Texas case details through official investigative channels, something private citizens like me couldn't easily access ourselves. She warned me it might take weeks, but that a documented pattern across 2 states would strengthen our case enormously. Meanwhile, construction on the ridge lots neared completion. Cabins gleaming with fresh paint and staged furniture for real estate photos. Denise scheduled an open house for prospective buyers, advertising the final phase of Pinewood Ridge's exclusive mountain collection, language that made no mention whatsoever of the ongoing legal disputes underneath it. I drove past that open house on a Saturday and saw a line of cars along the ridge road, families and retirees touring cabins that, depending on how the boundary case resolved, might legally sit on stolen land. It struck me then how many innocent people stood to be hurt by Denise's schemes. That thought changed something in me. This wasn't only about my 40 acres anymore, or even about justice for myself. It was about Carl Whitmore in Ohio, about whoever bought Cabin 14 or Cabin 9, people who deserved to know the ground beneath their future vacation home wasn't as solid as advertised. I decided to write everything down, not for a court filing this time, but for a local reporter named Sam Whitfield, who'd covered small stories about county corruption before and had a reputation for careful, patient digging. I sent him an email outlining what I'd found, expecting little in return. Sam called back within 2 days, more interested than I'd expected, saying he'd actually received a tip a year earlier about irregularities at Pinewood Ridge but had never found enough to justify a story. My documents, combined with his old notes, suddenly gave him a foundation solid enough to start investigating properly. For a few weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over everything. Construction paused near the creek per the injunction. The state investigation moved invisibly behind closed doors, and Sam Whitfield made careful calls I wasn't privy to. I spent those weeks fixing fences and pretending, for my own sanity, that life was normal. Odalise and I fell into a rhythm of quiet dinners, trading updates like soldiers comparing notes from different fronts of the same war. She'd become something like a co-conspirator in my quest for the truth, her decades of paralegal experience proving more useful than I ever could have anticipated when this started. During that lull, I finally had time to properly examine my grandfather's dam, something I'd neglected for years beyond routine maintenance. Walking the earthen wall with a flashlight one evening, I noticed the old spillway gate, rusted but intact, a mechanical release my grandfather had installed to control flooding downstream. I'd always assumed the gate was purely functional, a way to manage water levels during heavy rain seasons. But studying the old blueprints stored with the deed, I realized the reservoir behind my dam held far more water than I'd appreciated. enough to flood a substantial stretch of the lower Creek Valley if fully released. At the time, it was just an interesting technical detail, filed away alongside everything else I was learning about my own property. I had no plan for it, no intention beyond simple curiosity about the infrastructure my grandfather had built with his own hands 60 years earlier. That would change later. The quiet ended abruptly when Renata Osei called with news. The state investigation had uncovered enough evidence of the Texas settlement and the current fund.
Reallocation to open a formal inquiry into Denise's HOA finances, with subpoenas being prepared for bank records tied to the Growth Initiative account she controlled.
Sam Whitfield's story dropped the same week. Running in the regional paper under the headline "Boundary Dispute Reveals Deeper Questions at Pinewood Ridge." It was careful, factual, and devastating in its restraint, laying out the rigged election, the fund reallocation, and the suspicious inspection records without ever overstating what remained unproven. Denise's response was immediate and furious. She held an emergency press conference outside the Pinewood Ridge gate, calling the article a coordinated smear campaign by a disgruntled neighbor with a grudge over an old fence line, refusing to answer any specific questions about the fund reallocation or the Texas lawsuit. Watching the clip that evening, I noticed something in her eyes that hadn't been there during our first driveway confrontation months earlier. Not the easy, superior confidence of someone who knew she'd win, but something tighter, more brittle, the look of a person realizing the ground beneath her was shifting. Homeowners at Pinewood Ridge reacted with a mixture of denial and dawning unease. Some rallied around Denise, insisting the article was baseless gossip. Others, like Marjorie Klein, felt vindicated, finally armed with proof for suspicions they'd carried quietly for years without anyone willing to take them seriously. A second HOA board meeting was called. This one open to all members rather than Denise's usual small circle of allies. I wasn't invited, obviously, but Marjorie attended and called me afterward, describing a room thick with tension. Denise fielding hostile questions she'd never had to answer before in her tenure. According to Marjorie, Denise insisted the fund reallocation had been a strategic investment decision, fully within her authority as president, and that any irregularities in the prior election were administrative errors, language carefully chosen to avoid admitting wrongdoing while still sounding vaguely apologetic to nervous homeowners. It wasn't enough. Sensing the ground shifting beneath the entire HOA, quietly began cooperating with Renata's investigation, providing internal emails and financial records they'd previously been too intimidated or too loyal to share. The wall Denise had built around herself was developing real cracks. I felt something close to relief for the first time in months, though Priya warned me not to celebrate yet. Investigations can stall, she said. People with money and lawyers know how to slow things down for years. We need to keep our own boundary case moving forward, no matter what else happens. True to her warning, Denise's attorney filed an aggressive countersuit against me personally, alleging that my obstruction of the development had caused Pinewood Ridge financial damages exceeding $400,000, a number apparently calculated from lost cabin sales and delayed construction timelines tied to my injunction. Priya wasn't surprised. It's a pressure tactic, she said, meant to scare you into dropping your boundary claim before it costs you legal fees you can't afford. She was right that it scared me, staring at a lawsuit demanding money I'd never see in my lifetime, over land that was rightfully mine. I couldn't sleep properly for days after being served those countersuit papers, running numbers in my head, wondering if fighting for my grandfather's land might somehow end with me losing everything else I owned. Odile sat with me one night and reminded me, gently but firmly, that fear was exactly what Denise wanted. "She's not suing you because she thinks she'll win," Odile said. "She's suing you because she thinks you'll fold." That distinction mattered more than I expected. I called Priya the next morning and told her, however scared I wasn't dropping the boundary claim. Not now. Priya filed a response arguing the countersuit was retaliatory and lacked merit, given that my injunction had been legally granted by a judge based on documented deed evidence, not baseless obstruction. Judge Whitfield, reviewing both filings, scheduled a combined hearing to address the countersuit alongside the ongoing boundary dispute itself. In the weeks before that hearing, Renata's investigation deepened further, subpoenaing bank records that traced portions of the Growth Initiative Fund directly into a private account linked to Denise and her husband, Frank Calloway, an accountant who, until then, had remained almost entirely invisible in every version of this story. I hadn't given Frank much thought before, assuming he was simply along for the ride of his wife's ambitions. But Renata mentioned, carefully, that investigators were beginning to separate his role from Denise's, exploring whether he'd been complicit or, alternatively, whether he might have information he hadn't yet chosen to share. That distinction would matter enormously later, though at the time it was just one more thread among dozens. I focused instead on preparing for the combined hearing, spending long evenings with Priya reviewing every document, every timeline, every possible argument Denise's attorney might throw at us to undermine my claim. The hearing arrived on a gray, humid morning, the courtroom fuller than before, word having spread through both Pinewood Ridge and my side of the hollow that this case had become about far more than a simple fence line. Denise arrived without her usual crowd of supporters, flanked only by her attorney. Priya opened by dismantling the countersuit, presenting the original injunction ruling alongside evidence of the fraudulent survey and falsified inspections, arguing that any financial harm Pinewood Ridge suffered stemmed entirely from Denise's own reckless decision to build on contested land before the boundary was legally settled. Denise's attorney countered weakly, clearly unprepared for how thoroughly documented our case had become, falling back on arguments about good faith reliance on Gary Holt's survey. Judge Whitfield asked pointedly whether good faith extended to a surveyor who happened to be the HOA president's own first cousin. The question hung in the room like a held breath. Denise's attorney had no clean answer, and I watched something flicker across Denise's face. Not panic yet, but the first real crack in the composure she'd worn like armor since the day I met her in her driveway months earlier. Judge Whitfield dismissed the countersuit entirely, ruling it lacked sufficient merit given the documented irregularities in both the survey and inspection process. She also scheduled a final determination hearing on the original boundary dispute itself, giving both sides 30 days to prepare their complete evidentiary cases. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in months, though Priya cautioned again against overconfidence. "The boundary case is still the boundary case," she said. "This was a win, but the real fight is still ahead. Don't let relief make you careless in these next 30 days. I took her advice seriously, using the month to strengthen every piece of our evidentiary case, Revisiting the original deed with a forensic document examiner Priya recommended. Someone who could authenticate the 1962 language against county records from that same era to eliminate any possible claim of forgery or alteration. The examiner's report came back unambiguous. The deed was genuine, properly recorded, consistent with typical land descriptions of its period, and had never been amended or challenged in 60 years of county records. It was, Priya said, about as clean a piece of evidence as she'd ever seen in a boundary case. Meanwhile, Denise's world continued unraveling on a separate front. Renata's investigation formally charged Gary Holt with professional misconduct, revoking his surveyor's license pending further review, after investigators confirmed he'd never actually conducted an independent field survey of my property line at all, instead simply redrawing boundaries to match Denise's development plans. Walt Griggs, the county inspector, resigned abruptly the same week Gary Holt's license was revoked, citing personal reasons in a brief statement that fooled absolutely no one following the unfolding story. Sam Whitfield's follow-up article connected Griggs's resignation directly to the falsified inspection timeline uncovered through the toll record analysis. Each new revelation chipped away at whatever remaining credibility Denise held among Pinewood Ridge residents. Homeowners who'd once dismissed the allegations as gossip now openly demanded her resignation at increasingly contentious board meetings. Meetings Marjorie continued attending and reporting back to me in detailed, almost gleeful phone calls afterward. Denise, cornered on multiple fronts, grew increasingly erratic in her public statements, alternating between defiant denials and vague promises of full transparency once. All the facts are properly understood. Language that satisfied fewer and fewer people the longer the investigations dragged forward without any real accountability from her. I received an unexpected call one evening from Frank Calloway himself, his voice quiet and strained, asking if we could meet somewhere private. I agreed cautiously, uncertain whether this was a trap engineered by Denise or something else entirely. Something closer to what it actually turned out to be, desperation. We met at a nearly empty diner outside town. Frank arriving alone, visibly nervous, glancing toward the door every few minutes as if expecting Denise to walk in behind him. He told me he'd been an accountant for 20 years and had never once, before marrying Denise, considered himself capable of fraud. She told me it was temporary, Frank said, staring into his coffee. Move some money around, cover a gap until cabin sales came in, then move it back before anyone noticed. I believed her. Meeting after meeting, transfer after transfer, until there was simply too much to move back. Frank explained that the Growth Initiative Fund had ballooned far beyond simple reserve reallocation, incorporating personal loans he and Denise had taken against their own home, plus money quietly borrowed from at least 2 other HOA board members who trusted Denise enough not to ask uncomfortable questions about repayment timelines. He told me something else, too, something that made my stomach turn. Several of the 25 cabins, including ones already sold to buyers like Carl Whitmore, had been pre-sold as fractional timeshare units to multiple different buyers simultaneously. A scheme Frank said Denise had orchestrated to generate cash flow faster. Same cabin, Frank said, sold in pieces to 4 or 5 different families, each one thinking they owned the whole thing outright. She figured she'd sort out the paperwork once construction finished and the boundary dispute settled in her favor. She never planned on any of this actually falling apart. I asked Frank why he was telling me this now, after months of staying silent while his wife's schemes multiplied around him. He looked up, eyes wet, and said simply that he had a daughter from a previous marriage who trusted him, and he couldn't keep lying to himself about becoming someone she wouldn't recognize. Frank agreed to speak with Renata Osei directly, providing detailed financial records that traced every dollar of the Growth Initiative Fund, plus evidence of the fractional timeshare fraud affecting at least 6 of the 25 cabins, including documentation showing Denise had personally signed each duplicated sales contract. Renata called it a breakthrough, the kind of insider financial testimony that could transform a slow-moving civil investigation into something approaching criminal fraud charges. She warned me, though, that prosecutors would need time to build an airtight case, especially given Denise's history of surviving similar allegations once before in Texas. I asked whether the sealed Texas settlement details had ever come through. Renata confirmed they finally had, revealing that the earlier case had also involved reserve fund misuse and disputed elections, settled quietly when Denise agreed to resign and repay a portion of the missing funds in exchange for the HOA dropping criminal referral. In other words, Denise had done all of this before, learned exactly how far she could push before consequences arrived, and simply moved to a new state, a new HOA, and a new set of neighbors who didn't yet know her history. The pattern wasn't reckless. It was practiced, refined, deliberate. That realization changed how I understood everything that had happened to me. This wasn't a woman who'd stumbled into corruption through ambition or arrogance alone. This was someone who had built a career, quietly and methodically, out of exploiting exactly the kind of trust small communities extend to their elected leaders. Sam Whitfield's next article incorporated the Texas history, Frank's testimony, and the timeshare fraud allegations, painting a comprehensive picture that finally moved beyond boundary dispute into something the paper's editors were comfortable calling, in careful legal language, a pattern of alleged systemic fraud spanning multiple states and years. The story spread beyond our regional paper, picked up by a statewide outlet covering consumer fraud, which meant Carl Whitmore in Ohio and other out-of-state cabin buyers finally began hearing, through news alerts rather than Pinewood Ridge's own sales office, that something was seriously wrong with the properties they'd invested in. Carl called the Pinewood Ridge sales line demanding answers and was told, once again, that everything was under routine review, an answer that no longer satisfied him given what he'd read. He hired his own attorney and began reaching out to other buyers he'd met briefly during the open house months earlier. Within days, a small but furious coalition of out-of-state cabin buyers had formed, comparing notes and discovering, to their horror, that several of them held contracts for identical cabin numbers, each believing themselves the sole owner. Their combined outrage added yet another legal front against Denise, this one potentially federal in scope. Denise, facing mounting pressure from every direction, made what would prove to be a critical mistake. Rather than cooperating or negotiating a graceful exit, she doubled down publicly, insisting the entire situation was a misunderstanding fueled by a jealous neighbor, a disloyal husband, and journalists chasing a sensational story. That framing might have worked months earlier, before the evidence had piled up so thoroughly, but by now it read as exactly what it was: denial in the face of overwhelming proof. Even her most loyal remaining allies on the HOA board began quietly distancing themselves, unwilling to sink alongside her. A special HOA meeting was called to vote on Denise's removal as president, the first such vote in Pinewood Ridge's history. Marjorie described the atmosphere as electric. Homeowners who'd spent years too intimidated to challenge Denise finally speaking openly about fines, favoritism, and years of unquestioned, unaccountable authority. The vote passed overwhelmingly, stripping Denise of her HOA presidency effective immediately, though the position's removal did nothing to address the criminal and civil investigations still unfolding around her. If anything, losing her official platform seemed to make her more desperate, more unpredictable. In the weeks that followed, I should have felt triumphant watching her fall from that position, but instead I felt a strange unease, a sense that someone this practiced at manipulation, someone who'd survived a nearly identical collapse once before in Texas, wouldn't simply accept defeat quietly. I was right to feel that way, though I didn't yet know how right. The final boundary determination hearing approached, 30 days having passed since Judge Whitfield's ruling on the countersuit. Priya and I spent our remaining preparation time tightening every argument, anticipating that Denise, stripped of her presidency but still facing everything else, might fight this one battle with everything she had left. What we didn't anticipate was how far she'd actually go. 2 nights before the hearing, motion sensor lights near my dam's spillway gate flickered on in the middle of the night, waking me from sleep. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out to find someone had tampered with the old mechanical release mechanism. Whoever it was had fled before I reached the dam. But they'd left enough evidence behind, tool marks on the rusted gate housing, footprints in the mud, leading back toward the ridge road, to suggest someone had been trying to force the spillway open, potentially flooding the very creek valley below. I called the sheriff's department immediately, and a deputy arrived within the hour, photographing the damage and taking a statement. He couldn't say for certain who was responsible, but the timing, 2 nights before my boundary hearing against Denise Calloway, struck both of us as considerably more than coincidence. Priya, when I told her the next morning, went pale. If someone was trying to force that gate open, she said, they might have been trying to flood evidence, damage your property before the hearing, or make it look like your own dam was unsafe and unstable, undermining your credibility about controlling it. That theory unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I hired a contractor to inspect and reinforce the spillway gate immediately, documenting every repair thoroughly in case the sabotage attempt became relevant evidence later. Whoever had tried this clearly understood exactly how much the dam mattered to my case. The sheriff's department, reviewing traffic camera footage from a gas station near the Ridge Road, identified a vehicle registered to a name I didn't immediately recognize, a young man named Kyle Dunmore, who, turned out, had done occasional handyman work for Denise around her own property over the previous year. Kyle, questioned by deputies, initially denied everything, but eventually admitted Denise had paid him cash to check on the old dam and see whether its release mechanism could be triggered remotely or easily forced, framing it at the time as simple curiosity rather than anything resembling sabotage or vandalism. Whether Kyle fully understood what Denise intended remained unclear, but his statement was enough for deputies to formally question Denise about the incident. She denied any wrongdoing, claiming Kyle had misunderstood a casual conversation, though the timing and specificity of his account made that denial increasingly difficult to believe. Priya filed the sabotage incident as supplementary evidence in our boundary case, arguing it demonstrated a consistent pattern of Denise attempting to circumvent legal processes through improper means rather than legitimate argument. Judge Whitfield, reviewing the filing, agreed to allow it as context for the upcoming final hearing. I found myself now looking at my own dam differently than I ever had before, not just as family infrastructure, a quiet piece of my grandfather's legacy, but as something Denise clearly feared enough to risk sabotaging. That fear told me something important about how central the water rights truly were to her entire scheme. With the hearing now just one day away, I reviewed the old blueprints one final time, studying the spillway's capacity, understanding fully for the first time just how much water sat behind that earthen wall, and just how directly it would flow toward whatever remained standing on the disputed creekside lots below. The final boundary hearing opened with Priya presenting our complete case, the authenticated 1962 deed, the forensic document examination, Gary Holt's revoked survey license, Walt Griggs's falsified inspections, and now the dam sabotage attempt, weaving together a narrative of a boundary dispute inseparable from a much larger pattern of fraud. Denise's new attorney, hired after her previous one withdrew amid the mounting scandal, offered a weaker defense than any we'd faced before, largely reduced to arguing technicalities about survey methodology rather than substantively disputing the deed's clear historical language regarding the creek center line as the true property boundary. Judge Whitfield allowed both sides extensive time to present, clearly aware this case had grown far beyond a typical property line dispute. When Denise herself took the stand, under oath, her composure cracked further than I'd ever witnessed, her answers growing evasive and contradictory under even gentle questioning from Priya. Asked directly whether she'd known Gary Holt's survey lacked any independent field verification, Denise claimed she'd trusted her cousin's professional judgment without personally reviewing his methodology. Asked why she'd proceeded with construction despite my documented deed challenge, she claimed her own attorneys had assured her the boundary matter was essentially settled. Priya pressed further, introducing Frank's testimony about the fractional timeshare sales, watching Denise's face shift from defensive composure to genuine alarm as she realized her own husband's cooperation with investigators had reached directly into this courtroom, undermining defenses she'd clearly rehearsed for entirely different lines of questioning. "I want to be clear," Denise said, her voice rising, "that any decisions regarding cabin sales were made independently by our sales team, not by me personally." It was a claim directly contradicted by contracts bearing her own signature, documents Priya immediately produced and entered into evidence before Denise could retract the statement. Judge Whitfield, reviewing everything presented, took a brief recess before returning with her ruling. The 1962 deed, she confirmed, unambiguously established the creek's center line as the true property boundary, meaning every structure Denise had built within that disputed zone sat, legally and permanently, on land belonging entirely to me. The ruling ordered immediate cessation of any further construction within the disputed boundary and required Pinewood Ridge to formally address the encroachment.
Though Judge Whitfield noted that remedies, removal of structures, compensation, or negotiated purchase would require a separate follow-up hearing given the scale of what had already been built.
I'd won. Mine. Confirmed by a judge. Backed by 60 years of recorded history and a fraud investigation that had exposed exactly how illegitimate Denise's competing claim had always been. And yet, Walking out of that courtroom, I felt strangely unsatisfied, aware that winning on paper wasn't the same as resolution. Cabins still stood on my land. Buyers like Carl Whitmore still held contracts, however fraudulent, for properties now legally recognized as sitting on someone else's property. The mess Denise had created wouldn't simply vanish because a judge had ruled in my favor. It would take months, maybe years, to fully untangle. Denise, predictably, refused to accept even this ruling gracefully. Within days, her new attorney filed an emergency appeal, arguing the boundary decision would cause catastrophic and irreversible harm to innocent third-party cabin buyers who deserved protection regardless of any underlying property dispute between the HOA and its neighboring landowner. It was, I recognized bitterly, the same tactic she'd used from the very beginning, invoking harm to others as a shield for her own wrongdoing, as though the buyer's suffering was somehow my fault for defending land my grandfather had legally owned since before Denise Calloway was even born. Priya assured me the appeal was unlikely to succeed given how thoroughly documented the underlying fraud had become. But appeals still took time. Time during which cabins remained standing, buyers remained in limbo, and Denise remained free to cause whatever additional chaos her increasingly desperate circumstances might inspire. That desperation surfaced again barely a week later. Odalise called me late one night, her voice tight with worry, saying she'd seen unfamiliar trucks moving equipment onto the ridge under cover of darkness. Equipment that looked less like construction machinery and more like something meant to reinforce or expand existing structures quickly. I drove up toward the ridge road cautiously, keeping my distance, and confirmed what Odalise described. Crews working by floodlight, rushing to complete finishing work on several cabins despite the court's explicit order halting construction within the disputed boundary. Denise was defying a direct judicial ruling in plain sight. I called the sheriff's department immediately, and deputies arrived to find Denise herself on site, directing the crew personally, insisting the work being done was merely interior finishing, not construction covered under the court's halt order, a distinction that struck the deputies, and later Judge Whitfield, as flatly dishonest. Judge Whitfield, informed of the violation the following morning, was unambiguous in her fury, issuing an emergency contempt order against Denise personally and threatening jail time if any further work occurred on the disputed lots before the follow-up hearing addressing remedies for the encroachment had concluded properly. Denise, facing potential jail time for contempt on top of everything else unraveling around her, grew visibly more erratic in the days that followed. Marjorie reported that several remaining Pinewood Ridge residents had started avoiding her entirely, uncertain what she might do next in her mounting desperation to salvage something from the wreckage. I didn't know it yet, but Denise had already begun planning something far more reckless than late-night construction crews, something that would draw directly on the very damn sabotage attempt she'd apparently ordered weeks earlier, an attempt that had failed once but that she seemed determined not to abandon entirely. Frank Calloway called me again, his voice shaking more than during our diner conversation months earlier, warning me that Denise had been asking strange questions around the house about dam capacity, about how quickly water released from a spillway could travel downstream, about whether such flooding could be blamed on natural causes. I called Priya immediately, then the sheriff's department, relaying Frank's warning as precisely as I could remember it. The deputy who answered took it seriously given the prior sabotage attempt. promising increased patrols near my property. Though he cautioned that a warning alone wasn't enough to justify Denise's arrest without direct evidence. That night, I barely slept, walking down to check the spillway gate every few hours, flashlight in hand, jumping at every rustle of wind through the trees. Odalise insisted on staying over, refusing to let me sit alone with this particular fear, and I was more grateful for her company than I could express. 2 nights later, my property's motion sensors triggered again, this time catching clear footage of a figure approaching the dam under cover of darkness, working at the spillway mechanism with tools before apparently hearing my dog bark and fleeing back toward a vehicle parked on the ridge road above. Sheriff's deputies, reviewing the footage, identified the figure not as Kyle Dunmore this time, but as Denise herself, her face clearly visible in one frame as she glanced back toward the house before running. It was, finally, undeniable, direct evidence connecting her personally to an attempt at criminal sabotage. Denise was arrested the following morning on charges of attempted vandalism and violation of the court's active contempt order, her second attempt at tampering with the dam mechanism, transforming what had once been circumstantial suspicion into a documented criminal act captured clearly on my own property's security footage. Her arrest made headlines beyond even Sam Whitfield's careful reporting, picked up by television stations covering what one anchor called a stunning collapse for a once powerful HOA president, now facing charges ranging from fraud to attempted sabotage of her own neighbor's property. The story had become impossible to ignore. I felt no satisfaction watching footage of Denise being led from her home in handcuffs, only a heavy, complicated exhaustion. Months of fighting had led here, to this moment, and rather than triumph, I mostly felt the weight of everything it had cost. Money, sleep, peace, and any illusion of a simple, quiet life. Renata Osei called shortly after the arrest, informing me that the combination of financial fraud evidence, the fractional timeshare scheme, and now criminal sabotage charges, had given prosecutors more than enough to pursue a comprehensive case against Denise, one likely to result in significant prison time if convicted on the full range of charges. Frank Calloway, meanwhile, reached a cooperation agreement with prosecutors, avoiding criminal charges himself in exchange for complete testimony against Denise and full financial restitution wherever possible from assets he still controlled. He told me, in our final conversation, that he planned to leave the state entirely once everything concluded. I asked him, before we hung up, whether he had any regrets about coming forward. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Only that I didn't do it sooner, he said. Maybe if I had, fewer people would have gotten hurt. Maybe you wouldn't have had to fight so hard for something that was always yours. With Denise now facing criminal charges and out on bail under strict conditions, the follow-up hearing addressing remedies for the boundary encroachment finally proceeded. Priya and I had to decide what we actually wanted. Forced removal of every structure on my land, or some negotiated resolution that might serve everyone better. I thought about Carl Whitmore, about Marjorie Klein, about all the innocent homeowners and buyers caught in Denise's wreckage through no fault of their own. Demolishing every cabin outright would satisfy a certain sense of justice, but it would also punish people who'd been deceived just as thoroughly as I had. Priya suggested an alternative, negotiating a structured buyout, where the HOA's remaining assets and any recovered restitution funds would compensate me directly for the land, allowing existing legitimate cabin owners to retain their properties under a corrected boundary agreement, while any fraudulently duplicated timeshare contracts would be voided and refunded. Felt like the fairest path forward, though it required trusting a legal process that had already failed me once before, back when the county allowed construction to proceed despite my clear deed. This time, though, with a judge's ruling, a criminal investigation, and public scrutiny all aligned, the process finally seemed to hold. The remedies hearing resulted in exactly the structured resolution Priya had proposed. A substantial land compensation payment funded by remaining HOA assets and Denise's forfeited holdings.
Legitimate cabin buyers allowed to retain corrected, properly surveyed properties, and fraudulent duplicate contracts voided with buyers refunded from a court-established restitution fund.
Carl Whitmore called me directly after learning the outcome, thanking me, somewhat to my surprise, for pursuing the case as far as I had. "I know you weren't fighting for me," he said, "but you ended up protecting people like me anyway. That matters more than you probably realize." I hadn't thought of it that way before, but he was right. What started as a fight to protect my grandfather's land had become something that protected dozens of other families too. People scattered across several states who'd nearly lost their savings to a scheme built entirely on someone else's arrogant, calculated deception. Denise's criminal trial, scheduled for several months later, would ultimately need its own separate reckoning. But the civil resolution alone marked the effective end of Pinewood Ridge's growth initiative and, with it, the end of Denise Calloway's decade-long career of quietly exploiting community trust for personal gain across 2 different states. Gary Holt, stripped of his surveyor's license, faced his own separate professional misconduct proceedings, while Walt Griggs's resignation triggered a broader county review of his past inspection records, revealing several other properties where his signed approvals raised similarly troubling questions about work he may never have actually performed. Pinewood Ridge itself elected new HOA leadership in the aftermath. A smaller, more cautious board led by Marjorie Klein, who insisted on transparent paper ballots, independent financial audits, and open board meetings. Changes, she said, should have existed from the very beginning, long before Denise Calloway ever arrived in the county. As all of this unfolded around me, I finally returned my attention to my own land, walking the boundary that had cost me so much to defend, standing at the edge of my dam, looking out over water my grandfather had once controlled to protect exactly this kind of quiet, hard-won peace. Denise's criminal trial began nearly 5 months after her arrest, delayed repeatedly by her defense team's attempts to suppress evidence, challenge witness credibility, and request venue changes. Tactics Priya described as standard for defendants with enough remaining resources to prolong a case rather than accept an obviously unfavorable outcome. I was called to testify about the initial boundary dispute, the survey stakes, my grandfather's deed, and everything I'd personally witnessed throughout the escalating conflict. Sitting in that witness box, facing Denise directly for the first time since her arrest, felt like closing a loop that had opened in her driveway months earlier. Denise's attorney attempted to paint me during cross-examination as an obstructionist neighbor motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate legal concern, suggesting my pursuit of the boundary case had been disproportionate to any actual harm caused. I answered plainly that I'd simply asked, from the very beginning, for my land back. Prosecutors called witness after witness in the following days. Ray Tuthill describing falsified inspection paperwork. Marjorie Klein detailing the rigged election. Renata Osei walking the jury through the financial trail connecting HOA reserves to Denise's personal investment schemes. And finally, Frank Calloway, offering the most damaging testimony of all. Frank described, in careful, methodical detail, every transfer, every fractional timeshare contract, every conversation in which Denise had assured him their scheme was temporary before it metastasized into something neither of them could fully control. His testimony, delivered without visible malice, carried a weight that seemed to devastate the jury. Carl Whitmore also testified, describing his own experience discovering he'd purchased a fraction of a cabin sold simultaneously to 4 other families, the financial anxiety and betrayal he'd felt, and his gratitude that a stranger's boundary dispute had ultimately exposed a scheme that could have cost him his entire retirement savings. Denise took the stand in her own defense, maintaining throughout that she'd never intended to defraud anyone, that circumstances had simply spiraled beyond her control, and that the dam sabotage attempts represented panic rather than genuine malicious intent. The jury, watching her testimony against the weight of accumulated evidence, appeared unconvinced. During closing arguments, the prosecutor methodically walked through 8 years of documented behavior, the rigged election, the reserve fund reallocation, the falsified survey, the fractional timeshare fraud, and finally, the criminal sabotage attempts, framing it not as a woman overwhelmed by circumstance, but as a pattern of deliberate, calculated exploitation. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days before returning verdicts on every count. Guilty of financial fraud. Guilty of falsifying HOA election results. Guilty of fraudulent property sales related to the timeshare scheme. And guilty of attempted criminal sabotage related to the dam tampering incidents caught on my security footage. Judge Whitfield, presiding over sentencing several weeks later, cited Denise's prior similar conduct in Texas as an aggravating factor, noting that this wasn't a first offense but rather a demonstrated pattern spanning nearly a decade and multiple states, one that had caused genuine financial and emotional harm to dozens of innocent people. Denise was sentenced to 7 years in state prison, along with substantial restitution obligations to defrauded cabin buyers and the HOA itself.
A sentence that Sam Whitfield's final article on the case described as a rare instance.
I attended the sentencing, sitting quietly near the back of the courtroom, watching Denise's face as the judge read the verdict aloud. For the first time since our very first encounter in her driveway, I saw something in her expression that looked genuinely, finally, like defeat rather than calculated performance. Frank Calloway, having cooperated fully throughout the investigation and trial, avoided prison time himself but faced significant financial restitution obligations of his own, along with the professional consequences of having his accounting license suspended pending a lengthy ethics review by the state board that oversaw his profession. I ran into him one last time at the courthouse after sentencing, and he shook my hand, something that felt strange given everything that had happened, but also somehow appropriate. "Take care of that land," he said. "Your grandfather built something worth protecting. I hope you never have to fight for it again." Gary Holt's separate professional misconduct case concluded with permanent revocation of his surveyor's license and a substantial fine, effectively ending his career entirely. Walt Griggs faced similar consequences, along with a broader county investigation into every inspection he'd conducted over his final 2 years as an active inspector. Pete Nunley, the county commissioner whose conflicted vote had allowed conditional construction to proceed in the first place, resigned quietly amid the fallout. His connection to Denise's investment fund becoming public knowledge through the same financial trail that had ultimately exposed her broader scheme of manipulation and fraud. Kyle Dunmore, the young man Denise had initially paid to test my dam's mechanism, cooperated fully with investigators once his own involvement came to light, avoiding serious charges himself in exchange for detailed testimony about exactly what Denise had asked him to do and why she'd wanted it done quietly. With the criminal proceedings finally concluded, I turned my attention back to the practical work of restoring my own land, coordinating with the court-appointed administrator, overseeing the compensation and restitution process for legitimate cabin buyers who remained in properties now correctly surveyed onto Pinewood Ridge's actual, undisputed territory. The compensation I received for the portion of my land Denise had improperly built upon was substantial, enough to cover every legal fee I'd accumulated over the preceding year, with a meaningful sum remaining to finally make the repairs my roof and outbuildings had needed for years before any of this began. Marjorie Klein invited me to a small Pinewood Ridge community gathering several weeks later. An event meant partly to mark the HOA's fresh start under new, more transparent leadership. I hesitated at first, given my complicated history with the community, but ultimately accepted, curious to see how things had genuinely changed. Walking through the gate I'd once viewed with such resentment, I found a noticeably different atmosphere. Residents speaking openly about board decisions, financial records posted publicly on a community bulletin board, an ordinary neighborhood finally freed from the quiet, suffocating control Denise had exercised over it for nearly a decade. Carl Whitmore, turned out, had decided to keep his corrected, properly surveyed cabin after all, having grown genuinely fond of the mountain views despite everything he'd endured to finally, legitimately own it. He introduced himself in person for the first time, thanking me again with a warmth that felt entirely earned. I spent that afternoon walking the newly corrected boundary line with a county surveyor, an honest one this time, confirming precisely where my land ended and Pinewood Ridges legitimately began, the fraudulent stakes and false lines finally replaced with an accurate, permanent marker reflecting exactly what my grandfather's deed had always said. Standing at that boundary marker, I thought about how strange the entire ordeal had been. A dispute that began over 25 cabins and a stolen creek bank, but that ultimately unraveled nearly a decade of systemic fraud, protecting people across multiple states who'd never even heard my name before all of this happened. Odalise, walking beside me that day, squeezed my arm and said something I'd remember for a long time afterward. "Your grandfather built that dam to protect this land," she said. "I don't think he ever imagined it would end up protecting so many people who didn't even know it existed." I thought about my grandfather often in the months that followed, wondering what he would have made of everything that happened, the courtroom battles, the falsified surveys, the criminal trial, the strange, unexpected way his old spillway gate had become both a target for sabotage and, ultimately, a symbol of everything worth defending. I began restoring the dam properly that autumn, replacing the aging spillway mechanism with modern equipment while preserving the original structure's essential design. A small tribute to the man who'd built it decades earlier without ever imagining the role it would eventually play in exposing a fraud spanning nearly 10 years. Priya stopped by one afternoon to deliver the final paperwork, closing out our case entirely. Every legal thread finally tied off. Every judgment satisfied. Every appeal exhausted or abandoned. "It's over," she said, handing me the folder. "Really? Completely over. You can stop waiting for the next call now." It didn't feel entirely real at first. After so many months of expecting some new complication, some fresh maneuver from Denise or her attorneys. But the calls stopped coming. The construction stayed halted. The land, finally, unambiguously, remained mine, exactly as my grandfather's deed had always described it. 60 years earlier, Sam Whitfield published one final piece on the case. A retrospective examining how a simple boundary dispute had exposed systemic corruption spanning county officials, a fraudulent surveyor, and an HOA president with a history of similar schemes in another state entirely, calling it a reminder that small fights sometimes reveal larger truths. I read that final article sitting on my porch, looking out over the creek that had started everything, the water running clear and undisturbed beneath a sky finally free of construction dust and survey flags. For the first time in over a year, the hollow felt exactly like what it had always been, mine. Marisol called that evening, congratulating me properly for the first time since this entire saga began, joking that I should consider a career in land law given everything I'd learned. I laughed, genuinely, for what felt like the first time in months, the tension of the preceding year finally beginning to loosen its grip. But peace, I would learn just weeks later, had one final test still waiting. Denise, appealing her sentence from prison through a newly hired attorney, alleged that key evidence from my property security footage had been improperly obtained, arguing the footage should be suppressed and her conviction potentially overturned on procedural grounds. Priya explained that this kind of appeal was common, almost expected, from defendants with any remaining resources or motivation to fight. But she cautioned that even a long-shot appeal could reopen old wounds, forcing witnesses back into depositions and dragging the case's careful resolution back into uncertain territory once again. I felt the familiar knot of anxiety return, the sense that this fight might never truly end, that Denise's capacity for manipulation extended even from behind prison walls, still searching for some technicality that might unwind everything the courts, the investigators, and dozens of witnesses had worked so hard to establish. The appellate court scheduled a hearing to review the suppression claim, requiring testimony about exactly how and why my property security system had captured Denise's second sabotage attempt, testimony that meant revisiting, in painstaking detail, the night I'd feared she might finally successfully flood or destroy my grandfather's dam. Priya prepared meticulously, tracing the security system's installation records, its legal compliance with state surveillance regulations, and the sheriff department's proper chain of custody for the footage from the moment it was recovered through every step of its use in Denise's original criminal trial and conviction. At the appellate hearing, Priya demonstrated conclusively that the security footage had been legally installed, properly disclosed to law enforcement, and correctly preserved throughout the investigation, leaving no legitimate grounds for suppression regardless of how desperately Denise's new attorney tried to manufacture a procedural technicality from thin air. The appellate judges took the matter under advisement, a process Priya warned could take several more weeks. Weeks I spent once again in that familiar, exhausting state of waiting, checking my phone constantly, trying and failing to fully relax into the peace I'd only just begun to genuinely believe might be permanent. During that waiting period, I received an unexpected letter, not from any attorney or court, but from Carl Whitmore, thanking me once more and mentioning that several other former Pinewood Ridge buyers had organized a small support network, sharing legal resources and cautionary advice for anyone considering HOA vacation properties in the future. Reading his letter, I felt something shift in how I understood the entire ordeal. What had begun as an intensely personal, isolating fight over 40 acres had, almost accidentally, created a community of people who'd never have known each other otherwise, bound together by having survived the same elaborate, calculated deception. The appellate court finally issued its ruling 3 weeks later, unanimously rejecting Denise's suppression claim and affirming her original conviction and sentence in full, closing off what Priya described as genuinely her last realistic legal avenue for overturning any part of the outcome established during the original trial. I read the ruling twice, then a third time, allowing myself, finally, to believe it completely. There would be no further appeals with any real chance of success. No more depositions. No more waiting for some final maneuver from a woman who had spent nearly a decade evading consequences before finally facing them. Odalise brought over a bottle of good wine that evening, and we sat on my porch late into the night, talking not about lawsuits or depositions, but about ordinary things, her grandchildren, my plans to finally repair the old barn, the way the creek sounded different now that survey flags no longer lined its banks. I thought about Denise often in the weeks that followed, not with anger exactly, but with a kind of tired curiosity about how someone could spend a decade building an elaborate architecture of manipulation, only to lose everything so thoroughly and so publicly, undone ultimately by an old deed and a stubborn neighbor. Marjorie Klein sent me a card that winter, thanking me on behalf of the entire Pinewood Ridge community for what she called accidentally saving us from ourselves, noting that the new leadership's transparent practices had already prevented 2 smaller instances of favoritism that might otherwise have gone unnoticed under the old regime. I hung that card on my refrigerator, a strange little memento from a community I'd once viewed as nothing but a source of conflict and encroachment, now transformed into something closer to genuinely grateful neighbors, people who understood exactly what my stubborn insistence on defending an old family deed had ultimately protected. Frank Calloway, having relocated out of state as he told me he planned to, sent one final brief email that spring, mentioning he'd found work in a smaller accounting firm, rebuilding his professional reputation slowly, and that his daughter had recently told him she was proud of how he'd eventually chosen to do the right thing. I never heard directly from Denise again after her sentencing, though Sam Whitfield mentioned in passing that she remained in state prison, her earlier appeal exhausted, her once formidable reputation reduced to a cautionary tale. Local realtors reportedly still mentioned when warning prospective buyers about thoroughly researching HOA leadership before purchasing. Renata Osei called one last time that spring, informing me the state's oversight division had used the Pinewood Ridge case to push through new regulations requiring independent audits of HOA reserve funds and mandatory paper ballot verification for community elections, changes she credited directly to the evidence our combined fight had uncovered. "You didn't just win your own case," she told me. "You helped change how these things get handled statewide going forward." I hadn't thought about the fight in those terms before, had mostly just wanted my creek back, My grandfather's land respected. My quiet hollow returned to the peace it deserved. But standing at my dam that spring, watching water flow steadily through the newly restored spillway toward a creek finally free of survey stakes and construction noise, I understood that some fights, however personal their origin, end up reaching further than anyone fighting them could have ever reasonably anticipated. I began repairing the old barn that summer. The project I'd delayed for years, even before Denise Calloway ever appeared in my life. Finally finding the time and peace of mind to focus on my own land rather than defending it from someone else's elaborate, decade-long scheme of manipulation and fraud. Marisol visited that summer, walking the newly marked boundary with me, admiring the restored dam, teasing me gently about becoming, in her words, the most litigious farmer in the county. I laughed, telling her I hoped never to set foot in a courtroom again, having had more than my lifetime's fill. Carl Whitmore visited briefly that autumn, staying in his corrected, legitimately owned cabin, stopping by my property to share a drink and thank me once more, this time in person rather than through letters or phone calls. "Funny how things work out," he said.
"Never thought I'd end up..."
I found myself agreeing, genuinely surprised by how many unexpected relationships had emerged from what had once felt like an isolating, exhausting fight. Odalise's steady friendship, Marjorie's grateful correspondence, Carl's easy company, even Frank's quiet, complicated redemption, all threads woven from the same unraveling of Denise's elaborate deception. Priya sent a final invoice that autumn, smaller than I expected given everything her office had done throughout the ordeal, along with a handwritten note, wishing me well and reminding me, only half joking, to keep every important document photographed and backed up from now on, just in case history ever rhymes. I took her advice seriously, setting up proper digital backups for every deed, every survey, every piece of correspondence related to my land, determined never again to be caught unprepared the way I'd been that first morning. I found survey crews staking flags across my creek bank without any warning at all. Sam Whitfield's reporting on the case eventually earned him recognition from a statewide journalism association. And he told me, over coffee one afternoon, that the story had reshaped how he approached local reporting entirely, teaching him that patient, careful digging into seemingly small disputes could sometimes expose far larger patterns of harm. I thought about that conversation often afterward, about how close the entire truth had come to staying buried. If I'd simply accepted Denise's first dismissive wave of her hand in that driveway, if I'd lacked the stubbornness, or the resources, or simply the luck, to keep pushing until the whole scheme finally collapsed. Winter came again, quieter than any winter I'd experienced since my father's passing. The hollow settled fully back into the rhythm it had known before Pinewood Ridge's ambitious expansion ever threatened to swallow it whole. I spent those cold months finishing the barn, reading by the fire, finally simply living on my own land. Odalise and I grew closer that winter, our friendship deepening into something neither of us had quite expected when this all began over a year earlier. She told me once, only half joking, that Denise Calloway had accidentally done us both a favor, forcing two stubborn, solitary people to finally rely on each other. I laughed at that, though there was truth buried in the joke. Whatever else Denise's scheme had cost, money, sleep, months of anxiety and fear, it had also, unexpectedly, built something good in its wreckage. Friendships and community connections that might never have formed without the shared struggle against her manipulation. Spring arrived again. A full year and a half since survey crews first appeared uninvited on my property line. I walked the creek bank one morning, watching the water run clear beneath a sky finally, completely undisturbed by construction dust or legal uncertainty, and felt something I hadn't fully experienced in longer than I could remember. Simple contentment. Marjorie called that spring with news that Pinewood Ridge's new leadership had voted to install a small plaque near the community's entrance, acknowledging the past mismanagement and committing publicly to the transparency principles adopted in its aftermath. A modest but meaningful gesture toward genuine accountability rather than quiet, convenient forgetting. She invited me to the small ceremony marking its installation, and though I hesitated briefly, given everything Pinewood Ridge still represented in my memory, I ultimately attended, standing among neighbors who'd once been strangers, watching a community slowly, deliberately choose honesty over the comfortable silence that had enabled Denise for years. Standing at that ceremony, I thought about my grandfather, about the deed he'd written with such careful, deliberate language 60 years earlier, language that had ultimately outlasted every attempt to erase or override it. He couldn't have known, writing those words in 1962, exactly what they would someday be called upon to protect. That evening, walking home from the ceremony, I stopped at my dam one final time, watching the spillway release its steady, controlled flow of water downstream, exactly as my grandfather had designed it to do decades earlier. It occurred to me that this quiet, patient structure had outlasted every scheme built against it. I thought, too, about the night Denise herself had come, tools in hand, trying to force that same spillway open, trying to weaponize the very water that had once merely irrigated fields into something destructive, something that might have flooded evidence, damaged property, or simply expressed her desperate refusal to accept defeat gracefully. She'd failed, both times, caught on camera by security systems she hadn't anticipated, undone finally not by some dramatic confrontation but by the same patient, careful documentation that had characterized my entire fight against her from the very beginning. Photographs, timestamps, records, the quiet discipline of simply writing everything down. I realized, standing there at the dam that evening, that the story people would eventually tell about this, the story Sam Whitfield had already begun writing, the story Marjorie retold at community gatherings, the story I imagined Carl Whitmore shared with friends back in Ohio, would likely emphasize the dramatic moments, the sabotage attempts, the courtroom confrontations, the dramatic unraveling of a decade-long fraud scheme spanning 2 states. But standing there myself, I understood the truth was quieter than that, built from patient records, honest neighbors, and a deed my grandfather had written with more foresight than he could have possibly imagined. The dam itself, ironically, had never actually needed to flood anything to win this fight. Its mere existence, its water rights clearly described in that 60-year-old deed, had been enough, combined with patient documentation and honest testimony, to eventually expose everything Denise had built on lies, favoritism, and calculated exploitation of trust. Though there had been that one moment, months into the fight, when I genuinely considered opening that spillway myself, deliberately, to flood the disputed construction site and force an immediate, undeniable reckoning rather than waiting for slow courts and careful investigators to eventually catch up with obvious, mounting evidence of fraud. Priya had talked me out of it firmly, reminding me that vigilante flooding, however satisfying it might feel in the moment, would likely cost me any legal standing I had, transforming a clear, documented boundary victim into someone facing property damage charges of my own. Exactly the kind of gift Denise's attorneys would have celebrated. I'd listened to her advice, grudgingly at first, then with growing gratitude as the slow, patient path of documentation and testimony ultimately proved far more devastating to Denise than any single dramatic act of flooding could have accomplished. Patience, in the end, had built a case no attorney could ever unravel. Still, there was something satisfying in knowing the capability had always existed, that my grandfather's old spillway gate, however rusted and neglected before this ordeal began, held within it the power to undo everything Denise had built. If patience and proper process had somehow failed to deliver justice on their own. That knowledge, more than any specific victory in any specific courtroom, felt like the truest inheritance my grandfather had left me. Not just 40 acres of land, not just an old earthen dam, but the understanding that some things, built carefully and defended patiently, could outlast even the most determined attempts to steal them. I finished restoring the barn that summer, 2 full years after survey crews first appeared uninvited on my creek bank. Odalise helped me paint the final coat, and we stood back together admiring the work. 2 people who'd become genuine friends through an ordeal neither of us had asked for or expected. Carl Whitmore visited again that summer, bringing his grown daughter to see the cabin he'd nearly lost entirely to Denise's fractional timeshare fraud. Standing on his porch, looking out over the same ridge where construction crews had once rushed to finish illegal work under cover of darkness, he seemed genuinely at peace. Marjorie's leadership at Pinewood Ridge continued earning quiet respect throughout the county, the community's reformed practices becoming something of a model for other HOAs grappling with their own concerns about transparency and accountability following the widespread coverage of Denise's spectacular, decade-spanning collapse into fraud and criminal conviction. Sam Whitfield published a longer feature piece that summer, revisiting the case a full 2 years later, interviewing everyone from Carl Whitmore to Renata Osei to Frank Calloway, painting a comprehensive picture of how one landowner's stubborn insistence on an old deed had ultimately protected dozens of families across multiple states. I read that final feature sitting on my porch, the same porch where I'd first learned survey crews were staking flags across my property, and felt, for the first time, something like genuine closure rather than merely relief. The story, finally, complete, told honestly, without exaggeration or unnecessary drama, exactly as it happened. Renata mentioned in that final feature that the new state regulations inspired by our case had already prevented at least 2 similar schemes from developing elsewhere.
HOA boards catching irregularities early thanks to mandatory audits and verified elections. Protections that hadn't existed before Denise Calloway's ambitious, fraudulent decade finally caught up with her.
I thought about that legacy often in the months that followed. How something that began as a deeply personal fight to protect 40 acres my grandfather had loved had ultimately reshaped protections for homeowners across an entire state. People who would never know my name but who'd benefit from what I'd endured. Frank Calloway sent one final letter that autumn, mentioning he'd finally rebuilt enough professional trust to have his accounting license reinstated under strict oversight, and that his daughter had recently visited him for the first time in years. A small but meaningful sign of the slow, difficult redemption he'd been working toward. I felt genuinely glad reading his letter, understanding better than most how thoroughly Denise's manipulation had touched everyone around her, not just the neighbors she'd defrauded, but even her own husband, caught up in something that had metastasized far beyond whatever modest ambition might have first led them down that path. Odalise and I spent that autumn slowly, comfortably, the kind of easy companionship neither of us had expected to find at this stage of our lives. Born unexpectedly from months of shared anxiety and careful evidence gathering against a woman who'd never imagined two stubborn neighbors might actually bring down her entire scheme. I visited my grandfather's grave that November, something I hadn't done in longer than I wanted to admit, and stood there quietly, telling him, somewhat foolishly perhaps, about everything that had happened, the survey crews, the courtroom battles, the dam that had ultimately outlasted every scheme built against protecting it. Standing there, I felt certain, in a way I couldn't fully explain, that he would have been proud, not of the lawsuits or the courtroom drama, but of the patience, the documentation, the stubborn refusal to simply accept a lie when the truth, however slowly it arrived, remained entirely on my side. By the following spring, 3 years after survey crews first appeared uninvited on my creek bank, Pinewood Ridge had settled fully into its reformed identity. Denise Calloway remained in state prison serving her sentence, and I had finally, completely, returned to the quiet, ordinary life my grandfather's land had always promised me. I sold a small portion of my restored barn's harvest that autumn, the first real crop I'd grown in years, finding unexpected satisfaction in simple, ordinary work after so many months consumed entirely by legal battles and criminal investigations. The land, finally, felt like mine again in every sense that mattered. Odalise and I began spending nearly every evening together that year. An easy, comfortable rhythm neither of us rushed to define with any particular label, content simply to enjoy the quiet companionship that had grown steadily from shared adversity into something neither of us had expected but both genuinely valued. Carl Whitmore's daughter eventually purchased her own small property near Pinewood Ridge, drawn by her father's stories about the community's hard-won transparency and the surprising friendships that had formed from its darkest chapter. She mentioned, meeting me briefly, that she'd grown up hearing my name told almost like local legend. I laughed at that, uncomfortable with the idea of being anyone's legend, insisting I'd simply defended what was rightfully mine and refused to back down when someone with more money and confidence assumed I would. That refusal, more than any particular cleverness or courage, had made all the difference in the end. Marjorie retired from active HOA leadership that year, satisfied the reforms she championed had taken root deeply enough to survive her eventual departure, passing leadership to a younger board member equally committed to the transparency principles born directly from the wreckage of Denise's decade-long, multi-state pattern of calculated fraud. I thought, watching the changing of that guard from a respectful distance, about how thoroughly one woman's arrogance and greed had reshaped an entire community, not through the harm she'd caused, though that harm was real and lasting, but through the accountability her exposure had ultimately forced into being. Standing at my dam one final quiet evening, watching water flow steadily through the spillway my grandfather had built and I had since restored, I understood that this land had never truly needed saving from Denise Calloway. It had simply needed someone stubborn enough to remember and prove exactly whose it always was. The creek ran clear that evening, past cabins now legitimately owned, past a community finally governed honestly, past a boundary marker reflecting exactly what an old deed had promised 60 years earlier. My grandfather's dam stood quiet and steady, having outlasted every scheme built against the simple, patient truth it protected. I never opened that spillway in anger, never needed to. The land, the deed, and the truth had done the flooding for me, washing away every lie Denise Calloway ever built, until nothing remained standing but what was honestly, legally, and permanently